Okay, good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us for this, the final seminar. But we do have a Dante dialogue coming up in 2 weeks' time. If you go down to Paradiso, which is on Tuesday, the 17th of June at 2 o'clock. But this is our final seminar and lecture of the year, and I'm delighted to welcome a friend to the centre and a man who's been here in Cork a few times. That's Dr. Jonny Wiles. And I say Dr. Jonny Wiles because Jonny recently completed his PhD in Italian studies in Selwyn College, Cambridge, where he had a GEB studentship. The doctoral work focused on absences in the work of Dante, and he's previously written on Boccaccio, Anna Maria Trese, and the modern Italian lyric. He is Associate Director of the Chronicle Theatre Company, which specialises in outreach programmes on Shakespeare between the UK and Italy. So he's a multifaceted kind of figure, and someone also shut the door there. Ciao. And the title of Jonny's talk with us today is The Poetics of Absence in Dante. A te la parola.
Well, thank you, Gareth, for that introduction, and thank you all very, very much for being here. Yeah, this is my first sort of academic outing following the end of the PhD process, so it's really lovely to have friends, old and new, here and online. It means an awful lot that you're all here. Okay. Can people
You share screen, yeah?
Ah, okay. Così.
Yeah. Entire screen. Yeah, screen. And
There we go. And is that?
And then do the hide underneath that. There. Perfect.
There we go. All right. In the early days of September in 1911, visitors thronged to the Louvre in Paris in far greater numbers than usual. Despite an ongoing heat wave, one of the worst in France's history, people were queuing in droves for a chance to enter the gallery. There must have been something very worth seeing for people to enjoy the punishing sun in such numbers. But that something wasn't André Mantegna's Martyr de Saint-Sébastien, added to the Louvre's collection some months earlier, nor was it the new purchase of Nicolas Poussin's L'Inspiration du Poète that was attracting such an unusually large audience. No, these people were queuing because a few days earlier, on August 23rd, a man dressed in museum workers' clothes had left the Louvre under the cool early morning sun with a painting carefully concealed beneath his smock. That painting was the Mona Lisa, and the crowds were thronging to the gallery, not because it had been returned, but because it hadn't. In fact, it wouldn't be returned to Paris for another 2 years. They were lining up to see the empty space on the wall where the Mona Lisa had been hanging when it became the victim of what is now widely regarded as one of the most significant art heists in history. They were queuing to see where the Mona Lisa wasn't. They were queuing to see an absence. So I begin with this example because I think it demonstrates quite clearly our human interest in and attraction to absence. Absence of people, absence of things, absence of language, let's say silence. We're all very used to this, to these kinds of ideas. Someone's absence can bear more weight than their presence. Silence can ring louder in our ears than language or sound. I doubt I'm saying anything here that anyone doesn't already know. In fact, I doubt I'm mentioning anything here that anyone hasn't directly experienced. These are quotidian human experiences, aren't they? And yet scholarship on absence, and especially absence in art, is and has always been comparatively scarce. And this has been the major motivating force behind the work that I've been doing over the last few years. So let's set out some parameters. What are we talking about when we're talking about absence? Well, I'm going to base this afternoon's seminar on a rather broad, but nevertheless, I think, quite useful notion put forward by the editors of the 2010 volume, The Anthropology of Absence. In it, the editors propose that our experiences of absence are predicated upon confrontation with the incomplete. We can see how the patrons of the Louvre were seeking to indulge in this exact experience, a glaring and sudden incompleteness in the gallery's collection, which they had an impulse to confront. Although the scope of the anthropology of absence is oriented towards broader sociological studies of absence, the notion of absence as confrontation with incompleteness is highly applicable to artworks, and it's something that artists in various spheres have tapped into. Michelangelo's Non Finiti are a really notable example in the plastic arts. We might also mention works that are characterized by reduction, by removal and erasure, pieces which make use of pre-existing material by occluding or erasing some or all of the original work. Robert Rauschenberg's Erased de Kooning drawing is a particularly striking example, as would be Naomi Uman's anti-pornographic film Removed, all of whose eroticized female figures have been carefully whited out from the spools of film with acid. Still more recently, the visual artist Derek Beaulieu has produced a version of John Cage's Silence with all of its text removed, a response to Cage's own controversial soundwork, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. One of the primary aims of my doctoral work has been to demonstrate the applicability of this idea in literature, and in particular to the works of Dante. The work explores how Dante orchestrates confrontations with incompleteness throughout his works and proposes that an alertness to these confrontations is fundamental to an appreciation of his poetics as expressed in the Commedia, as well as in his work more broadly. I realise, though, that the proposition to talk about and indeed to study absence in Dante might strike you as odd. This is a writer, after all, whose corpus culminates in a poem with the self-proclaimed scope of containing the entire Christian universe, legato con amore in un volume. And yet, I'm sure many of you can think of at least one episode in the Commedia where absence speaks louder than presence. I should have done bingo cards or something like that, shouldn't I? Never mind, next time. Now, of course, on one level, absence in narrative is inevitable. It stands to reason that within the Commedia's finite textual space, Dante had to be selective about what, and indeed about whom, he included in his narrative, filing down content as he constructed the poem. Exclusions, and hence absences, are a functional necessity in narrative texts. As Catherine Pausland has recently pointed out in her work on narrative participation in the Commedia, it is neither possible in terms of volume of description, nor desirable in terms of reader engagement to describe every detail of the people, places, and events evoked. So, in any text, readers must constantly make inferences to fill in these gaps in order to establish logical coherence. The Commedia, like any narrative text, must, to use Pausland's terminology, be gappy to a certain extent. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is, first of all, suggest why we might want to look at the gaps in Dante and the Commedia in particular. And in doing so, I also want to offer some ways in which we might approach what's not there in a more robust and systematic way than we have done in Dante studies to date. What we need for this, I think, both in Dante studies and in literary studies more broadly, is a more thoroughgoing and crucially more specific lexicon for the discussion and analysis of literary absence than we've hitherto tended to deploy. Dante scholarship in particular is in need of a vocabulary which allows for examination of the significance of individual absences, as well as their cumulative experiential effects in Dante's work, both in and beyond the Commedia. The bedrock for the vocabulary deployed in my work has been Timothy Walsh's 1998 volume, The Dark Matter of Words. In it, Walsh develops a theory of conspicuous literary absence, which he defines as the intentional use of language to call attention to something missing in a specific and recognizable way. Absence, that is, which is carefully delineated in a given text and thus rendered meaningful. Absence, Walsh draws an important distinction between these conspicuous absences and what he calls pure absences, absences to which no such attention is drawn. The importance of the distinction between conspicuous and pure absence in the Commedia is clearly illustrated during Dante's encounter with Buonaggiunta da Lucca in Purgatorio 24. Io a lui, io mi sono che quando amor mi ispira, noto e a quel modo che vita dentro vo significando. O fratti e s'avveggio di sé il nodo che il notaro e guitone e meri tenne di qua dal dolce stil novo chiodo. Long lost as a blueprint for Dante's conscious overturning of 13th century poetic praxis, This moment also instantiates the commedia's strategic deployment of conspicuous personal absence. Guidone d'Arezzo and Giacomo da Lentini are directly invoked here as Buonaggiuntas and Dante's artistic predecessors, and as such they form an integral part of the Commedia's, and especially Purgatorio's, thematization of artistic lineage and poetic surpassing. Nevertheless, despite Dante's engagement with both poets on the thematic and lexical levels, and despite the fact that Guidone will be named again in Purgatorio 26, neither poet is personally encountered in the poem. Giacomo and Guidone remain di qua, not just of the revolutionary poetics of the Stil Novo, but also from the interpersonal poetic encounters so characteristic of the second cantica. Logic dictates that they must be somewhere in the poem's three realms. The Commedia's fictional setting in 1300, after all, comfortably post-dates their deaths in around 1260 and 1294, respectively. If they're not, then they are granted a remarkable and unique existence outside of Dante's cosmos, and one which violates the teleology upon which the poem, and indeed all of Christian theology, is predicated. As soon as these poets are named, then, the fact that they are not present as characters in the narrative is brought into focus. Named absences of this kind are conspicuous absences, while unnamed absences are pure absences. Thus, in Purgatorio 24, the absences of Guidone and Giacomo are made conspicuous in the way that those of, say, Gallo Pisano or Nino Moccato, named alongside Guidone and Giacomo as poets of fame in the De Vulgare Eloquentia, are not. And though these pure absences may cast revealing light on Dante's filing down of the vernacular poetic canon, in cases such as these, it is, I would suggest, the poem's conspicuous absences which exert more profound shaping effects on its narrative and poetics. The distinction between conspicuous and pure absence, though, is not quite sufficient for tackling absence in the Commedia specifically. Many sociological and psychological studies of absence discuss non-present people in terms of their physical absence. And such terms can hold only the most limited currency in the case of the Commedia, populated as it is so extensively with ombre vane. Nevertheless, there has been a tendency in Dante scholarship to discuss dead souls in terms of physical forms and features, a habit which, while helpful as a critical shorthand, does the dynamics of Dantean vanità a bit of a disservice, I think. To speak of the physicality of any of the Commedia's dead souls is problematic at best, and as such, the notion of physical presence, and therefore physical absence, can really be of only limited use. Dante's presentation of the souls in his afterlife, each with their own corpo fictizio, cannot be understood with any consistency in physical terms. The poem's persistent problematization of interpersonal tangibility demands that we confront its presences, and by extension its absences, in a more nuanced fashion. As we know, the materiality of Dante's otherworldly bodies is constantly at issue, and the poetics in each cantica depend on shifting levels of tangibility, for which any straightforward notion of physical presence or absence cannot account. In order to negotiate these complexities, I needed a terminology that allowed for the vicissitudes of the poem's treatment of otherworldly bodies, one which accounts for the Commedia's careful distinction between corpo human and corpo fictizio. One of the key intertexts for this process was Heather Webb's work on personhood in the Commedia, in which she posits that Dante utilizes descriptions of gesture in conjunction with other forms of psychological and spiritual embodiment in such a way that, and I quote, "we may develop a sense of the personal presence of the character that gestures." The experience of personhood in Dante's poem, Webb suggests, depends on the cultivation of new perspectives with regard to interpersonal relationship. A sense of personal presence in the Commedia derives not from the experience of personal bodies, which are transient in Dante's conception of life and afterlife, but from deeper aspects of human action and interaction. Taking my cue from Webb's analysis of Dante's construction of character, I contrast the notion of personal presence with its implied opposite, personal absence. The term allows for discussion of the voids opened up by the poem's variously missing persons, while avoiding the problems inherent in discussing the physicality of Dante's dead souls. How then is conspicuous personal absence constructed in the Commedia? Well, One of the clearest and most direct ways in which it's achieved is through the question ove, or dove, which, wherever it's asked, invariably draws attention to absence of one kind or another. Though ove is widespread across the commedia in an indicative, locative context, its use in questions is surprisingly uncommon, occurring cumulatively some dozen times across the commedia. Within this relatively small subset of interrogatives are three particularly significant cases, one in each cantica, which play a role in Dante's orchestration of absence experience. And it's these that I want to spend the rest of my time discussing. The three moments in question occur during Dante's encounter with Cavalcanti dei Cavalcanti and with Foresi Donati, and as Dante turns to Beatrice following his contemplation of the celestial rose. As might be expected, the context in which these questions are asked and answered play an important role in shaping readerly understanding of the role of absence in the commedia, and this, in turn, provides significant insight into the poem's evolution from a narratological perspective. In The Syntax of Desire, Elena Lombardi makes the following threefold distinction pertaining to the way in which desire operates in the commedia. In the comedy, she writes, the discourse of language also intercepts that of desire. By structuring the three otherworldly realms in terms of loss in Inferno, lack in Purgatorio, and fulfillment in Paradiso, desire also interprets personal as well as universal history. Lombardi's analysis finds a strong resonance with sociological studies of real-world absence experience, which themselves shed significant light on the ways in which Dante deploys personal absences in the commedia. In her essay on seeing absence, the cultural geographer Anna Ferenikova posits a model of perception of absence predicated on three main forms of absence experience. Failed searches, such as failing to find a set of keys on a table, violations of implicit expectations, such as an empty frame in a gallery, if you think that there's going to be something there, and losing perceptual contact, as when the face of a loved one gets lost in a crowd, for example. In what follows, I argue that these three categories of absence experience can be seen at play in the commedia, and that they have an important bearing on the evolving narrative frameworks of the three cantiche. And I also want to propose that together they have significant cumulative effects on the commedia, and especially on its poetics as they evolve throughout the three cantiche. So, the episode in which the first ove occurs, which is also the first time the question occurs in the poem, has generated immense critical attention. You know where I'm going with this. In the circle of the heretics in Inferno 10, Dante's dialogue with Farinata degli Uberti is stalled by the appearance of Cavalcanti dei Cavalcanti, on whose lips the question practically trembles. D'intorno mi guardò, come talento avesse di veder s'altri era meco. E poi che il sospechar fu tutto spento, piangendo disse, se per questo cieco carcere vai per altezza d'ingegno, mio figlio ov'è? E perché non è teco? Cavalcanti's language and gestures are highly symptomatic of a response to personal absence. His urgent desire and subsequent despair are a direct result of his failure to visually locate his son Guido, whose role in the commedia has generated a vast and diverse array of critical responses. Before Cavalcanti can make any utterance, his instinct is to look around to see if Guido is present, only to have his hopes checked as he witnesses his absence. Immediately then, Cavalcanti's behavior bears out Ferenikova's notion of the failed visual search. Cavalcanti sees his son's absence and allows it to dominate his interaction with Dante. Commentators, including Erich Auerbach, have moreover underscored the urgency with which Cavalcanti inserts himself into the narrative. His interruption simply cannot wait, it seems, for the end of Dante's interaction with Farinata. At the same time, though, it shouldn't be lost on us that Cavalcanti's entry into the poem is gestural rather than verbal, and strong focus is given to that visual search, with guardare and vedere appearing in quick succession before he speaks. Guido's fixation in his father's thoughts is made plain before he is able to ask his overwhelming question, and the text makes Cavalcanti wait while the nature of his interruption is described. As we'll see in a moment, in line with their respective poetics of desire, in Purgatorio and Paradiso, absence experiences are characterized in large part by the acceptance of deferral and characters' intellective responses to promise and lack. In Cavalcanti's case, by contrast, the poem itself holds him back from asking the question he's so desperate to ask by inserting narrative material between his entry into the poem and his opportunity to speak. This is, moreover, a scene which strongly anticipates Jean-Paul Sartre's non-encounter with his friend Pierre, described in a well-known passage in Being and Nothingness. If we look at the passage, we can see that Sartre's gestures in response to Pierre's absence mirror Cavalcante's own gestures remarkably closely. As he looks around, the forms and faces of the cafe briefly become objects of focus before falling into the nondescript neutral ground of the expected encounter. I am witness, Sartre writes, to the successive disappearance of all the objects which I look at, in particular of the faces, which detain me for an instant, and which as quickly decompose precisely because they are not the face of Pierre. Nevertheless, if I should finally discover Pierre, my intuition would be filled by a solid element. I should be suddenly arrested by his face, and the whole cafe would organize itself around him as a discrete presence. The decomposition of the image of Dante and Virgil in Cavalcante's vision is rapid. They are not. Guido, punto e basta. And far from disappearing as a visual object, Farinata is never so much as acknowledged by Cavalcante by word or look. In a twist of infernal irony, Cavalcante's failure to acknowledge God's presence in life culminates in an experience of damnation characterized utterly by experience of absence. It is an infernal situation which cannot organize itself around the discrete presence of his son, Guido. And with this in mind, it doesn't seem incidental that Cavalcante's absence experience is followed hard upon by Farinata's account of infernal myopia. Noi veggiam come queca mala luce le cose, disse che ne son lontano, cotanto ancor ne splende il sommo duce, quando s'appressano son, tutto è vano, nostro intelletto. These lines provide a further significant gloss on Cavalcante's ordeal. Not only does his sight fail him in the moment of his encounter with Dante, his limited vision of present earthly events further precludes his ability to deduce the reality of Guido's situation, whatever it may be. This process of deduction is rendered all the more difficult by the ambiguity of Dante's response to Cavalcante. Da me stesso non vegno, colui qu'attende là per cui mi mena, forse qui Guido vostro ebbe a disdegno. It's a response which yields still further layers of misinterpretation, as I'm sure you all know. Come dicesti egli ebbe, non vive egli ancora, non fiere gli occhi suoi lo dolce lume. Cavalcante takes no time to parse Dante's response and jumps to the worst possible conclusion. Scholars have long interrogated the interpretative issues surrounding cui and ebbe in Dante's response, though less, I think, has been done to account for the contribution of forse to this hermeneutic knot, which Cavalcante's interpretive faculties cannot unravel. Here, forse adds further semantic complexities to a moment already rife with opportunities for negative misreading. Such cumulative ambiguity pushes Dante's response to Cavalcante to the point of complete hermeneutic confusion for Cavalcante. This network of ambiguities surrounding Cavalcante's Ove gives rise to another significant way in which the question contributes to infernal responses to personal absence. Robert Wilson has used Cavalcante's question as a means to discuss a problematic facet of infernal temporality, which in turn casts light back on the question itself, as asked by Cavalcante. Wilson observes that Cavalcante, whose death predates the poem's fictional journey by 20 years, must have foreseen Guido's death under the same mechanism of blindness that to the present that allows the damned to see le cose che ne son lontano. So impermeable are the individual narratives of the damned that Cavalcante fails to observe that Farinata is able to foresee future events which are close at hand, and is even able, seemingly, to discern facts about the present. Farinata's question to Dante, perché quel popolo è sì empio incontra i miei in ciascuna sua legge, introduces a curious present tense è, which opens up as many questions around the infernal experience of temporality as Cavalcante's does around infernal exposure to absence. Far from being any kind of compositional glitch, this dense network of temporal and deictic confusions serves to dramatize how experiences of personal absence in time and space are allowed to permeate the consciousness of damned souls, despite the utter fixity of their placement. Their worldly narratives have reached their end, but their investment in earthly affairs persists despite their own absence from and irrelevance to the ongoing drama of the world of the living. In her work on the psychological implications of absence on human consciousness, Elena Gigante breaks down the notion of assenza into its etymological roots, suggesting that la dinamica dell'abessere permette di istituire un gioco oscillante tra passato e presente, alimentato dalla tensione del desiderio verso il futuro. Past, present, and future vie within the infernal consciousness in such a way that the soul's sense of time collapses, and with it, their ability to express with any real precision the movement of time in language. An infernal situation of in an infernal situation, in a situation of infernal ab esse, the question of is itself misinformed. Small wonder that it gives rise to such a vicious cycle of misinterpretation and misinformation. And so it should perhaps come as little surprise that while absence forms part of the punitive mechanism of Inferno, it holds an equally significant reparative function in Purgatorio. Purgatorio's first dramatization of absence experience explicitly underscores the Cantica's divorcement from the insular absence experiences of Inferno. As Dante and Virgil arrive on the shore of the mountain, Virgil explains to Cato the circumstances of their arrival and appeals to him for help by means of a captatio benevolentiae. Non son lieviti eterni per noi guasti, che questi vive menos me non lega, ma son del cerchio ove son gli occhi casti di Marzia tua, che in vista ancor ti priega, o santo petto, che per tua la tegni. Per l'osso amore adunque a noi ti piega, lasciane andar per li tuoi 7 regni, grazie riporterò di te a lei, se d'esser mentovato laggiù degni. Cato's response, however, is unequivocal. He cannot be stirred to act by this appeal to his affections for his late wife. Marzia piacque tanto agli occhi miei mentre chi fu di là, diss'egli ancora, che quante grazie vosse da me fei. Or che di là dal mal fiume dimora, più mover non mi può, per quella legge che fatta fu quando me n'uscì fora. Cato is clearly aware of and feels Marzia's absence, but the teleological rupture between Inferno and Purgatorio means that it cannot evoke any affective response in him. This affective reorientation between the first and second realms is set into still sharper relief by the fact that Marzia still feels an affetto terreno for her husband. The fact that ancor piega, despite the metaphysical and teleological severance from her husband, aligns her experience of separation from Cato with the state of the other inhabitants of Limbo, who senza speme vivono in disio. Though she is in limbo, the fact that she now resides di là dal malfiume means that she has not undergone the same kind of affective reorientation as Cato has. Her experience of her husband's absence is seemingly akin to that of Cavalcante, in that it cannot be resolved from within her infernal context. The movement from Inferno to Purgatorio then entails an entire recalibration of the narrative and affective functions of personal absence. It is, after all, a transition from a space of radical isolation to an environment of absolute interpersonal openness, centered around what Webb calls conditions of mutuality. Such mutuality is seen at play when Dante meets his friend and fellow poet Forese Donati among the penitent gluttons. As their conversation unfolds, Dante asks Forese the whereabouts of his sister. E io, continuando al mio sermone, dissi, ella sen va forse più tardi che non farebbe per altrui cagione. Ma dimmi, se tu sai, dov'è Picarda? Dimmi se ho veggio da notar persona tra questa gente che si riguarda. Dante clearly expects that he will encounter Picarda, but this expectation has been checked throughout his purgatorial journey. This bearing out of Frenicova's second category of absence experience, that of violated expectation, is distinct from Cavalcante's failed visual surge, in large part by virtue of Purgatorio's poetics of openness. In Purgatory, questions can be asked and answers contemplated in ways that infernal self-involvement will not allow. Questo domandare, Anna Maria Chiavaci-Leonardi suggests, alla naturalezza propria del più genuino narrato della commedia. And this mimetic quality underscores the fact that in Purgatorio, questions are as natural as they are significant to the process of purgation. Further, the fact that it is Dante here, and not Forese, who voices the question ove, or dove in this case, evinces the importance of formative questions to Dante's own progress up the mountain in the second Cantica. And this instance in particular reveals the necessity of learning through interpersonal exchange. Nor is there any need for frenetic gestures of the kind which precede Cavalcante's ove. With perfect naturalezza, Dante is able to voice the question at an appropriate moment in his dialogue with Forese. Forese's response, moreover, is one of contentment in his own experience of his sister's absence. La mia sorella, che tra bella e buona non so qual fosse più, trionfa lieta nell'alto Olimpo già di sua corona. Unlike Cavalcante, even though Picarda is absent from the scene, Forese knows precisely where his sister is and feels no anxiety about the surety of their reunion. Dante will meet Picarda, Forese's speech implies, and so will he, but not now. To return to the terms of Lombardi's analysis, if Inferno is characterized by desire which cannot be fulfilled, Purgatorio centers around a purifying system of desire and deferral, predicated in this instance on temporary absence experience. Setting this purgatorial mechanism of delay alongside Forese's characterization of Purgatorio's cleansing pain, io dico pena, e dovrei dir solazzo, it becomes clear that Picarda's absence forms an integral part of Forese's purgatorial solazzo, just as Guido's underpins his father's infernal pena. The significance of this particular response to personal absence is heightened, in fact, in the wider context of Dante's encounter with Forese. In Purgatorio 23, Forese invokes another absent figure from whom he has been separated by death, and whose prayers have aided him in his purgatorial progress. Si tosto m'ha condotto a ver lo dolce senso di martiri la Nella mia con suo pianger dirotto. Forese's wife Nella is another important figure in the network of absences at play in this pair of cantos. The interplay of prolepsis and analepsis upon which Purgatorio's Poetics are founded culminates here in a double dramatization of absence experience, one rooted back on earth, the other in paradise. In marked contrast to the closed infernal experience of absence in time and space, this coalescence of past, present, and future is highly conducive to purgatorial progress. It resembles much more closely Gigante's notion of a gioco oscillante, as the souls are driven by their increasingly purified desire towards reunion with God. Forese's accounts of Nella and Picarda, then, are revealing of the ways in which personal absence functions in Purgatorio as a whole. The sociologist Avram Modrell characterizes grief and loss, grief at the loss and absence of loved ones, as an individual and dynamic blend of leave-taking and wayfinding. Now, taken in its entirety, Purgatorio itself constitutes just such an ongoing drama of departure and navigation, as Dante and the penitent souls follow the trajectories of their individual yet intersecting lines of becoming, a phrase which Teodolinda Barolini aptly uses to characterize individual purgatorial narratives. In this way, absence becomes an important part of what Manuela Cagnolati calls the productive pain of Purgatorio. Partaking in the dolce senso dei martiri involves a simultaneous acknowledgement and positive internalization of experiences of personal absence. Given the teleological continuity between the Commedia's latter two realms, of course, Nella's, Forese's, and Picarda's narratives will eventually be drawn together in paradise, assuming Nella makes it to paradise, but I think we're given every reason to presume that she will, unless something goes very, very wrong. The reoriented vision inculcated by the purgatorial journey allows for an understanding of the fact that such paradisiacal unions, though they may be deferred, are guaranteed, and once achieved, are synonymous with a union with God. As if to remind the reader of this dynamic of anticipated reunion, when she introduces herself to Dante in the Heaven of the Moon, Picarda will in fact echo the rhymes which brought her own name into the poem during the encounter with Forese. Io fui nel mondo vergine sorella, e se la mente tue ben se riguarda, non mi ti celerà l'esser più bella, ma riconoscerai chi son Picarda, che posta qui con questi altri beati, beata sono in la sfera più tarda. In her first spoken lines, from across the threshold between the two cantiche, the encounter with Forese is made to ring distantly but distinctly in our ears as his sister enters the scene through the systematic repetition of rhyme. Kenneth Clark suggests that repeated use of a given rhyme offers the reader a point of privileged intratextual access, acting like a lightning rod that runs vertically along the entire length of the poem. And it is precisely these lightning rods which allow for the affects of personal absence to take on new and distinct resonances as the commedia effects its transition between the second and third realms. Interestingly, however, though her words may recall her brother through the redeployment of rhyme, when she speaks with Dante in Paradiso 3, Picardo will make no direct reference to Forese. The souls of Purgatorio may be spurred on by their absence experience, but Dante is once again quick to establish that absence functions very differently in the third cantica. It is indeed Picardo herself who aids in Dante's understanding of the fact that ogni dove in cielo e paradiso, the co-presence of all of the blessed with God in the Empyrean. This fact alone is enough to elucidate the shift in the relationship between absence and desire in Paradiso. As many scholars have noted, the blessed still experience desire, but they exist in a state of continuous fulfillment. So it is that the blessed souls still feel a strong desire for their fleshly bodies, though the lack is experienced with no negative affect. As Solomon explains in the Heaven of the Sun, come la carne gloriosa e santa fia rivestita, la nostra persona più grata fia per essere tutta quanta. Dante's journey through the third cantica then constitutes an ongoing movement of increasing participation in this state of paradisiacal fullness of experience. Dante is unable to participate entirely in this state while he remains alive, but his increasing proximity to it is staged throughout the cantica. The culmination of this process is dramatized in the Empyrean itself at the moment of Beatrice's departure from Dante's side in Paradiso 31. As he contemplates the celestial rose, he turns to face Beatrice only to find that she has disappeared. E dove ella subito dis'io, ond'egli a terminar lo tuo disiro mosse Beatrice me del loco mio, e se li guardi su nel terzo giro dal sommo grado tu la rivedrai nel trono che suoi merti le sortiro. Dante momentarily loses perceptual contact with Beatrice, and his immediate dove ella constitutes a response to the sudden experience of her absence. As Chiavacci Leonardi observes, la domanda, diretta e immediata, dice l'unico pensiero di Dante in quel momento. Egli non chiede infatti che sia il nuovo venuto, ma soltanto dove sia con lei, che non vede più accanto a sé. There is, Chiavacci Leonardi suggests, a momentary uncertainty on the part of Dante, which might superficially resemble Cavalcante's. Cavalcante too does not take time to ask any questions other than his plain "mio figlio ov'è." But we must remember where we are. Crucially, in this paradisiacal space, the time of deferral is reduced to an instant. Dante experiences neither the permanent deferral of Cavalcante's failed visual search for Guido, nor the deferral of Picardo's expected presence. Nevertheless, the parallels are germane to this paradisiacal articulation of absence experience. As with Dante's encounter with Cavalcante, this moment is built around the redirection of the gaze. While Cavalcante looks about in panic, however, here the readjustment of the protagonist's perspective happens with ease and even with serenity. Senza risponder, gli occhi su levai e vidi lei che si facea corona riflettando da sé gli eterni rai. There is no need for Dante to question Bernard's response. He need only reorient his gaze for his desire to be sated. It is a key example of Peter Hawkins' observation that in Paradiso, surprise fades quickly into acceptance of fact, a resolution which the metaphysics of Inferno disallows and which becomes available only gradually in Purgatorio. In Forenikova's terms, then, in Paradiso 31, Beatrice momentarily disappears as a perceptible object, only to be restored to Dante's sight instantaneously. It is an absence experience which allows Dante to come as close as any mortal ever could to the dialectic of desire and satiety that characterizes the paradisiacal condition. Beatrice is, after all, immediately recentered in Dante's perspective, and his desire is instantly fulfilled, much unlike Guido's perpetual absence from his father's view. There is further no problematic cui or ebbe here to open up semantic confusion as there is in Inferno 10. Rather, the resolution comes from Bernard's swift and divinely simple future tense, tu la rivedrai. Jennifer Rushworth remarks that in the highest reaches of Paradiso, Beatrice can be infinitely distant but ever present. And it is precisely this paradox that comes to the fore in the poem's final articulation of personal absence in Paradiso 31. As this piece of divine understanding solidifies, Dante is allowed to participate, however briefly, in the instantaneous fulfillment of desire which characterizes the state of the blessed in Paradiso. So what I hope to have shown this afternoon is that reading the Commedia with an eye for its conspicuous personal absences reveals key ways in which such absences shape the poem's narrative, metaphysics, and thematic concerns. The poetics of each cantica are informed by shifting relationships between desire, absence, and fulfillment. Dante moves from a space of zero fulfillment in Inferno, deferred fulfillment in Purgatorio, and instantaneous fulfillment in Paradiso. And absence provides a key to a fuller appreciation of these evolving dynamics. Absence has more forms and functions in Dante's work than I've discussed this afternoon, but by focusing on the deceptively simple question of air, I hope to have given you at least a taste of the interpretative value of absence in and beyond the Commedia. The central proposition of my work and of this seminar this afternoon is that very often, in Dante, as in literature, as in life, as in the Louvre, sometimes what there isn't is just as important as what there is. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jonny. Excellent. Okay. So I just want to thank everybody for coming. It's really remarkable to see, especially in the room, so many people are here on a Friday afternoon in June. So thank you all. Some of you were not constrained. You came of your own volition, so I thank you all. That's really good. That was a fascinating talk, Jonny. I just want to kind of bring up one or two things. And the examples you gave are wonderful, but I always think when I'm thinking of absence in the Commedia, one for me, even though he's listed, one of the big absences is Frederick II, and it goes back to kind of 10, and he's listed there, you know, among più di mille who are down in these coffins, and he's just a Federico II, and then because we do have, Guido da Montefeltro, then we have a son in the Poetics, especially this kind of intergenerational thing. But you have with Frederick II, you have Manfred then in Purgatorio 3. You have a lot about Frederick II in Canto 13 of the Inferno, and then you have his mother, like Costanza, che generò terzo e l'ultimo passaggio in vento di Suave. And there's a lot of discussion. He is the kind of superstar emperor from Dante's era, the one they look back to, the Stupor Mondi. I mean, he seems to me like a glaring absence, and yet quite present politically and otherwise in the poem. I wonder if you could, what kind of absence is that, even though he's named?
Yes, certainly. It's an example, really, of what Filippo Fabbrigatore calls an incontro mancato. That's to say, a sort of prospective encounter that doesn't end up happening. It happens, yeah, absolutely, with Frederick II. The one that always bowls me over is Aeneas, having made that bold claim, io non Eneo, non Paolo sono, and then suddenly Aeneas is there and he doesn't even bother to talk to him. It seems like a bizarre choice to me. So yes, and it's interesting that so many of these characters, and it does happen more often in Inferno, that these characters do just become faces in the crowd. That formulation più di mille comes up quite a few times in Inferno, right? I suspect more than in the other two cantiche. And it's a curious one because it does create a certain kind of aporia, narratively speaking, doesn't it, in Inferno? Because we go, oh, hang on, well, there they go. Are we not going to have a conversation?
Yes,
exactly. We're sort of constantly made to look, well, di qua, di là, di su, di giù, and we're never quite sure whether we're actually going to get a conversation with somebody or not. And so Frederick II does feel like a really, really significant example of that. why he chooses to make Frederick an incontro mancato. Specifically, I'm not sure yet, particularly for all the reasons that you've spoken about. Thinking about Inferno 13 as well. Yeah, the fact that he's such a kind of he underpins so much of the narrative of that canto.
Yeah. And equally, I mean, yes, Guido Cavalcanti is an absence, but he's also a presence. And it's a big presence, and it's a fraught presence. And I'm not asking you to give your interpretation of it, but there is a presence to those absences.
Oh, there certainly is. Yeah, I mean, it is the most conspicuous. It's the absence really that is made the most conspicuous, isn't it, throughout the poem? I mean, we didn't have time today within the presentation to talk about Purgatorio 11, for example, but the fact that it does keep coming back, and there's certainly something to be said as well, and Baronini, among others, has done wonderful work on the Cavalcantian language of so many encounters, not least the encounter in Inferno 10, right? Yes, he's absolutely sort of present by virtue of his absence, if you want to sort of think about it in those terms. Robert Harrison calls that sort of spectral presence called the ghost of Guido Cavalcanti, which I think is rather nice, because it is a haunting in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, which kind of brings it into a different realm. But it's also, I mean, you could equally say, when absence becomes a textual presence in a different way, like the textual Virgil of the Paradiso, in his absence, but he's very much still present, and certainly with Cacciavida, Sanguis Meus, and so he's constantly, we're constantly reminded of Virgil through various things, including mentioning fail and things like that.
Certainly. It's an extraordinary process that Virgil goes through. He is a very physical, I'm using that problematic phrase that I said we shouldn't be using, but he is a very physical presence, a tangible presence for so much of the poem. Yes, and I think that the Virgilian intertextuality really depends on Virgil's personal absence in Paradiso, I think, for him to achieve its fullest effect.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. We have a question there from Lachlan, who's online.
Do I need to do anything?
No.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Jonny. I think you showed just how broad absence can be as a way to read the Commedia. I have a really sort of specific question based on one of your examples, but it's sort of about the project as a whole, which is the passage from Purgatory 24, Dolce Stil Novo. Pirovano has shown that that's actually an emendation. Like that line doesn't, this sort of famous line that we quote all the time, he points out is actually an emendation, doesn't exist in a sort of single manuscript copy. So it made me think a bit about the absence of the kind of autograph text. We are dealing with this like edited text. And seeing as you're talking about poetics, I was wondering if you could perhaps say a little bit more about the role of the reader, or why are those people going to the Louvre in 1911? Like, is there something that's sort of disentangled from the sort of authorial intention of it all and is more about this kind of reader response? Or how do these things sort of come into your idea of a specific poetics of absence?
Well, I think it's something that Dante really enjoins us to interpret, and absence in very sort of in the sense of exclusions. We're enjoined to interpret them and engage with them really throughout Dante's career. There's a really fascinating example in the Convivio, for example, where it's in the fourth trattato. And he says within the auto-exegesis, la poesia qui si taccia, and he says, well, it's there's a suppression of a detail here, and then he sort of explains what we're supposed to do with that, and that we're supposed to interpret the fact that the poem has fallen silent on a particular issue. And then, of course, there are any number of examples that we could quote from Vita Nuova, for example, where we get material being suppressed. I know you've done work on this, right? On the missing Serentese, for example. So once again, so for example, where the event of Beatrice's death, for example, gets completely excluded and sort of suppressed by the language of the Lamentations, for example. And then we of course get the gloss on that. So that's, of course, I'm aware that there's a big difference between those kinds of absences, those kinds of exclusions, one being a silence and one being a kind of an exclusion to core of material. They're different from personal absences, of course, but I think they all they fall within. They're things that Dante seems to be deploying differently, but they all kind of have they have a cumulative effect, I think, on the way that we're kind of being encouraged to engage with Dante's work, and I think that absolutely come. We see those strategies sort of writ large, definitely across the Commedia. They get refined and reworked throughout his career. Does that answer your question in terms of sort of how we're being sort of instructed to engage with exclusions?
It's extremely interesting, but it doesn't answer my question.
Okay.
I mean, the question is specifically about where the reader comes into this. I mean, if we ignore the fact that Dante wills this and Dante has these conspicuous absences or pure absences, and we sort of move away from this idea of what Dante wants us to do. Why are the people going to the Louvre, do you think? Like, do you
why
think
are people going?
Yeah, I mean, where does the sort of reader come into all of this?
I say, well, why are people going to the Louvre? I don't. Perhaps with the Louvre example, perhaps it's sheer incredulity, perhaps, or perhaps a desire to somehow participate in this extraordinary event. The same kind of impulse that leads us to need to sort of take selfies of ourselves in front of a beautiful landscape, right? To say that we've been there, we've seen this thing, right? I think it is an example of this really bizarre fascination that we have for incompleteness and absence. So those would be my guesses, having not been to the Louvre, having not been around in 1911 to be able to see to sort of be party to that. In terms of where the reader comes in, well, I think a lot there. It forms part, I think, of the heuristic journey that the reader goes on in the Commedia. The absence, and for example, like with the incontri mancati, right? We're constantly being encouraged to rethink the encounters and the non-encounters that we've had. In Inferno, for example, if somebody is, if we're told that somebody is in Inferno and that they might be seen, if they haven't been seen by the end of Inferno, they're not going to appear, right? Because there's no continuity. There's a teleological cul-de-sac, isn't it, Inferno? And so, for example, there's an exercise in kind of recontextualization that goes on there, which I think the reader is kind of made to be a part of. And then, of course, that functions very differently in Purgatorio and Paradiso, as in the examples of Forese that we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting.
Okay, George, did you have a question?
Actually did as well. Not the fourth one. Okay, I'm going to project. It's a couple of those are quite nice ones, I think. First of all, so you mentioned briefly filing down, filing down authors and words in Limbo.
Yeah.
Well, if you wanted, could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between filing down absence? Do we file down to a nothing, or what's the relationship there? And I want to ask about rhyme as well, because I enjoyed the reference to the lightning rods. Is there anything about rhyme that I don't remember the precise words, but something about affective connections or something, affective relationships? Well, I don't know what word you precisely use. There's lightning rod in some way links to some kind of affective relationship.
The affects of personal absence.
Yes. Yeah. Is there anything specifically about rhyme that lends itself to that? So those are the two questions.
Yes, I suppose the filing down question is a very, very interesting one. I suppose, because you can file in a sense, you can file a presence down. You can diminish the sense of a presence, can't you? But if you file it down into nothing, you're running the risk of turning it into a pure absence, right? Something that would you could very productively apply that idea to would be, for example, the process that we were mentioning a moment ago that Virgil undergoes, where his presence, it goes from being incredibly literally physical and tangible, and then it becomes far less sort of haptically oriented. The key operative word within there is kind of schema. Is schemare, right? This idea that he's reduced, and then eventually we are left schemi bise. And so we could think of that as a kind of as a process of the filing down of presence into absence, although it is a very, very conspicuous one, isn't it? As it's made, as it's introduced in Purgatorio 30. And then it becomes a very conspicuous intertextual presence that we witness for Virgil in Paradiso. So that's that's how I feel as if we could push that filing down idea a bit further. And then in terms of in terms of rhyme and thinking about how that's kind of contributing to how affect is the affects of personal absence. It's not. I've not gone terribly far into thinking about rhyme, to be honest, in the work to date. You'd be far more qualified than me to talk about the kind of the affects inherent in individual rhymes. Did any examples come to mind?
I like the way you did that. Together, you form a very nice person.
Wow. No, I don't know. I mean, rhyme. I've always thought about it as closing off an opening interpretation. So it makes links across.
Yeah,
right? It brings in different persons and different affective responses. So it's a fundamentally linking.
Yeah.
An outward-facing technique. So that's I guess would be linked to affect, which is emotion socially orientated, right?
That's very true. Yeah.
That might be a little bit of a brutal misreading of what affect is, and there's probably better people than me. That's what I understood, right? Is emotion,
sure.
Emotion outwardly negotiated.
It's a lovely idea. You'll need to think about it further.
Are there other questions in the room?
Online too.
Online from Eyster and John.
Okay, John, do you want to give us a question there, please?
Yeah, see if I can get myself here. Yeah, just maybe quickly, two other absences that I wanted to ask about. Just wondering if you had any thoughts on them. One is, in a sense, God.
Yeah.
That I was struck by the phrase in your talking of the Paradiso of instantaneous fulfillment, and just occurs to me that there's so many passages where Dante's concerned to say something about that which fulfills and at the same time creates desire, or something like that. I should have those on tap for you, but I don't. But there are. It seems to me that he's very deliberately following a theological thread there that says, also the experience of God in the next life is not the experience of grasping or comprehending entirely. It's a partial thing, leaving space for infinite, more desire, right? That's one. And then, sorry, this is a lot, but very quickly, the other absence is Dante's. That people will note. I teach the comedy a lot to first-time readers, and they're often very disappointed by the Paradiso because the character disappears, more or less, right? You don't get much of him after a certain point. And I wondered about that absence and whether you might relate it to your first example, the sort of Ars Poetica in 24, where he's sort of disclaiming responsibility in a sense, because I'm actually just following what love says, right? So there you go.
There's a lot there, John. Thank you. Yeah, the absence of God, absolutely. He's kind of the abesse, isn't he? That everything in the comedy is kind of tending towards. I suppose the other interesting aspect of that, in terms of, to come back to George's idea of kind of filing down, is that he can't be entirely, the experience of him can't be entirely absent from Inferno, can it? Because the kind of the poena damnis doesn't function unless you've got at least a sort of slight sense of God's presence and that it's being denied to you, right? So yeah, certainly it's it is a very sort of glaring absence that has different functions, I suppose, across the poem. It's really interesting what you say about Dante's own sort of, certainly his diminished personal presence in Paradiso, and because at the same time what's also happening there is it is the most sort of daring of Dante's poetic achievements, isn't it? So you can, whereas Dante character is very much it has his sense of presence reduced, but it seems to me that Dante poet feels very sort of poetically present in Paradiso. Different kinds of presence and absence, I guess, that we're thinking about there. But I think it's the poet, isn't it, who's coming into presence, possibly at the cost of the presence of Dante character in Paradiso. It's a really interesting thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
There seems to be more of an alignment with the Dante character with the actual reader in the Paradiso.
Yeah.
That it's almost like they seamlessly merge together, the reader and the Dante character, whereas Dante Poeta really comes into his own in the Paradiso.
Absolutely.
Whereas the other two canticles are intending towards this. I stay.
Hi, Jonny.
Hi,
Nice to see you. Anyway, so I feel like you've spoken about these things on other occasions, but all the Oves reminded me of the ubi sunt topos and how Dante's dealing with that. I mean, I wonder if we could say, I feel like you've said these things to me before, but can you just remind me where you think Dante might be dealing with all the ubi sunt and variations? All these implications of nostalgia and mortality and all these things, regret in some ways. I mean, Purgatorio 14 has like a very direct variation of that, but maybe you had some more things to say about that in relation to other.
Sorry. It's actually not something that comes up in my work at the minute, Easter. So it would be I can't really offer anything more than we've already spoken about.
All right. Any questions in the room?
Actually, I have a question. Okay, thank you for your amazing seminar. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, obviously, absence is such a huge theme, and it opens reflection about so many aspects. I was thinking, for example, about ineffability, the impossibility of describing, seeing something. It opens to so many aspects. Thinking also about what Dara was saying about the textual references to Virgil in Paradiso. I was also thinking about something else, because, for example, in Purgatorio 22, there are Statius and Virgil. Statius asks about, dimmi dov'è Terenzio nostro antico, and he asks about several Latin authors. And Terenzio, Cecilio, Plauto, Varro. Varro is more problematic, but the other three are comic poets. So, just curiosity, I was wondering if you ever considered, this passage or in general absence in a meta-literary perspective. So, just curiosity.
Yeah, certainly, and it's a really.
Can you just very briefly repeat the question for anyone who might be listening? Absence in a meta-literary perspective.
Yes, with specific reference to Purgatorio 22. Yes, certainly, and this is also this is an expansion of that already really very long enumeration of the virtuous pagans in Inferno 4, right? So it's almost like Dante comes back and has another go, kind of expands the list, right? So yes, absolutely. Again, these are sort of these are longer range incontri mancati, aren't they? Because we know now that there's, we're told about a whole sort of host of additional poets that we know we're now never going to hear from. It's a really, really strange one, isn't it? And perhaps it comes up at that incredibly densely meta-literary passage of Purgatorio 22 because of what's going on poetically at that stage in the Cantica. Other kinds of poetry are gaining in significance at this point in the poem, aren't they? So maybe it is a way of saying, okay, we have not encountered these poets, and perhaps at this stage in the journey we don't have to. And so yeah, in terms of we're kind of learning about who we're sort of learning about what kind of poetry and what kind of text is going to be significant to the journey by learning who we haven't had an opportunity to encounter, right?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a great question.
Sina.
Yeah, just always in this sense. I was wondering, the list of different authors, it can mean something, but the absence of Paul, like how do you explain that? Because like you mentioned that he's not meeting Aeneas, but Aeneas is, a character. He's guided by Virgil, so there's kind of a huge presence of the Virgilian aspect of the. But Paul, that is such an important model for Paradiso, for the journey in through the heaven. Like, do you think there any maybe meta-literary explanation, or it's just another missed counter?
There could well be. It's interesting that he suppresses encounters with both Aeneas and Paul, having sort of compared himself so conspicuously to them. I wonder, I wonder whether it is something that, because the comparison is actually made so explicit, would the encounters actually have detracted from Dante, Dante's own journey? Would the narrative, in other words, become sort of slightly too freighted by encounters with two other people, who do serve as such close models for him? So I wonder whether it's a decision motivated possibly by the same reason that we don't get to meet Aeneas. Nevertheless, it does strike me as very, very odd that he just they're not characters that are given a voice at all. It's a curious choice.
Maybe he's worried he might have recognized himself in them. You know?
Well, possibly.
John, do you have your hand is raised? Is that from the previous question, or is there another question?
No, sorry, that's just a glitch.
Okay.
I can't get it to go away. Yeah.
Tommaso, you have a question.
Thank you, Jonny. Your talk is very interesting, in my opinion, for this philosophical feature. And my question is inspired by that one of John Buckley. The principle on the basis of this principle of absence is where maybe the concept of absence in St. Augustine, which is the evil it is simply a lack of good, and so narratively in the Commedia this is expanded in different ways. Is it? Do you agree?
I think it is. It's a governing. It's an organizational principle, isn't it? Of certainly in Inferno and Purgatorio, right? The less good, or the more you lack good during your life, it's going to earn you a particular place in Inferno, or it's going to mean that you're spending an extra number of hundred years in Purgatorio, right? So absolutely.
So we are allowed to start.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Does the whole poem begin on a note of absence, in the sense that the sentimento that the protagonist feels is cannot find what is absent is the verace via.
Yeah.
So the whole thing is predicated on absence.
I think it is. I think it is. It's and there's the first canto is characterized by descriptions of lack, and then of course you've got Virgilio, who's first introduced into the poem in terms of his silence. Right? We're thrown several different kinds of lack in the very first canto of the poem, and then we spend certainly the rest of Inferno sort of learning how to deal with with infernal lack, and onwards from there. It's given such prominence so early on.
Wonderful, wunderbar. Okay, so folks, I think this is perhaps, given that it is a Friday evening, it is a good point to get Jonny off. So before we let him go, however, I just want to mention at the beginning, I want to just mention it again, we do have a reschedule. So some of you will know that we had our Dante dialogue that we had to reschedule the last time around, and so we're rescheduling for Tuesday, June the 17th at 2 p.m. That's entirely online, and it's a fascinating one. It is Figurandi Paradiso representing Paradise, and we have Professor Martin Kemp and Federico Rossi, who are going to be in dialogue. And this is one organized by Sina Caponetti and Isa Kiltanavucci, and we're really, really looking forward to it. And that will conclude the outward activities of the centre for this particular academic year. So please, if you see the advertisement for that, please register for that and come along. It should be fascinating, and I'm very much looking forward to it. It just leaves me to say thank you to Jonny. It was fortuitous, the timing of Jonny's visit to Cork. He didn't come specifically for the seminar, but once we heard he was in the environment, we snapped up the opportunity. And also because I think, and based on what we were listening today, I mean, Jonny recently graduated with his PhD, and he was vital for back in December.
Yes.
And this is an important study on Dante, and I'm delighted we had the opportunity to spend an hour in his company learning about it. So please join me in thanking John. Thank you. And now we'll stop the recording. Always be me. Sempre nel guardando.